libraries of Karhu, where the intellectual treasures of humanity were preserved for future generations, the Assyrian achievement stood complete, an empire that had conquered not just territories, but knowledge itself. But empires, like the mortal men who build them, carry within themselves the seeds of their own transformation. In the ancient city of Babylon, where Hammurabi had once carved justice into stone, a new vision was stirring that would challenge Assyrian dominance and create wonders that would inspire legends until the end of time. The rebellion began quietly in the market squares of Babylon, 600 years before Christ. Merchants whispered of opportunities that Assyrian tribute had denied them. Craftsmen spoke of techniques they could not perfect under imperial oversight. Priests murmured of ancient glories that foreign rule had diminished. But it was in the palace chambers where Nabopolassar, governor of Babylon under Assyrian authority, made the decision that would reshape the ancient world, the choice to transform his administrative position into the foundation for independence itself. The timing was perfect. Assyrian power, stretched across territories from Iran to Egypt, had reached the limits of what even the most sophisticated administration could effectively govern. Provincial rebellions erupted simultaneously across the empire, forcing Assyrian armies to divide their attention among multiple theaters, where local knowledge gave insurgents decisive advantages over imperial forces unfamiliar with regional conditions. Nabopolassar recognized that successful rebellion required more than local uprising. It demanded systematic alliance with other peoples who shared Babylon's desire for freedom from Assyrian dominance. His diplomatic genius lay in forging connections with the Medes, mountain peoples whose independent kingdoms controlled the strategic passes that connected Mesopotamia to the Iranian plateau. This Babylonian-Median alliance represented more than military cooperation. It embodied a vision of international relations based on mutual benefit rather than imperial subordination. Each partner contributed distinctive capabilities to their common cause while maintaining cultural autonomy within the alliance structure. The Medes provided mobile cavalry forces perfectly suited for mountain warfare, while Babylon contributed siege techniques and administrative expertise necessary for conquering and governing urban centers. The assault on Nineveh, the greatest of Assyrian capitals, demonstrated how effectively this alliance could coordinate diverse military capabilities. Median forces controlled the surrounding hills, cutting off supply lines and preventing reinforcement of the city's garrison. Babylonian engineers applied systematic siege techniques that methodically destroyed the massive fortifications that had protected Assyrian power for centuries. When Nineveh finally fell in 612 before Christ, the psychological impact throughout the empire was devastating. The city that had seemed invincible, whose palaces had housed the libraries containing all human knowledge, whose walls had never been breached by enemy forces, dissolved like mist before winds of change that had been building throughout the imperial territories. Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar III, understood that military victory was only the beginning of imperial transformation. To replace Assyrian dominance with lasting Babylonian authority required not just conquest, but the creation of alternative systems that could provide the security and prosperity that imperial subjects expected from effective government. Nebuchadnezzar's vision for Neo-Babylonian Empire combined respect for ancient Mesopotamian traditions with innovations that reflected changing conditions in the post-Assyrian world. Rather than ruling through military intimidation as the Assyrians had done, he sought to create imperial authority based on cultural prestige, economic opportunity, and architectural magnificence that would inspire voluntary allegiance rather than fearful submission. The rebuilding of Babylon itself became the centerpiece of this imperial program. The ancient city that had given the world Hammurabi's code would be transformed into a metropolis whose grandeur surpassed anything the ancient world had ever seen, an urban masterpiece that demonstrated Babylonian capabilities while honoring the cultural achievements of all peoples within the expanding empire. The new Babylon was not merely rebuilt, but reimagined as the ultimate expression of Mesopotamian urban planning and architectural artistry. Massive walls surrounded the city, their height and thickness exceeding even Assyrian fortifications, while incorporating design elements that emphasized beauty alongside defensive capability. These walls were not merely barriers, but works of art, whose glazed brick surfaces depicted processions of lions, dragons, and bulls in brilliant colors that caught sunlight like captured rainbows. The famous Ishtar Gate, main entrance to the rebuilt city, embodied Nebuchadnezzar's vision of imperial grandeur, serving spiritual purposes. Constructed entirely of blue-glazed bricks that seemed to capture the essence of sky and water, the gate was decorated with relief sculptures of sacred animals associated with Babylonian deities. Lions honored Ishtar, goddess of love and war. Dragons represented Marduk, chief god of Babylon. Bulls celebrated Adad, deity of storms and fertility. But the Ishtar Gate was more than architectural achievement. It was the entrance to a sacred way that connected the city's main religious complex to the ziggurat that dominated Babylon's skyline. This processional route, paved with limestone and lined with walls depicting over 100 lions in glazed brick relief, served as the stage for religious festivals that attracted pilgrims from throughout the empire and beyond. The great ziggurat itself, rebuilt and expanded during Nebuchadnezzar's reign, rose nearly 300 feet above the Mesopotamian plain in 7 massive step terraces that seemed to climb toward heaven itself. Each level was faced with different colored glazed bricks: white, black, purple, blue, vermilion, silver, and gold at the summit, creating a rainbow tower that was visible for miles across the flat landscape of central Iraq. This was the structure that would inspire the biblical account of the Tower of Babel, a monument to human ambition that seemed to challenge the very boundaries between earth and heaven. But for the Babylonians who built it, the ziggurat represented not prideful rebellion against divine authority, but the proper relationship between mortal achievement and eternal truth. A stairway that enabled communication between human and divine realms. At the ziggurat's base sprawled the temple complex dedicated to Marduk, chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon and divine patron of the imperial project. Here, priests from throughout the empire participated in rituals that acknowledged both local religious traditions and the overarching spiritual authority that legitimized Babylonian political dominance. The famous hanging gardens, constructed for Nebuchadnezzar's wife Ametis, who missed the green mountains of her native Media, represented another aspect of imperial vision that sought to accommodate, rather than suppress, cultural diversity within unified political structures. These terraced gardens, watered by sophisticated hydraulic systems that lifted river water to heights that seemed to defy natural law, created an artificial mountain landscape within the urban environment. The gardens were more than romantic gesture. They demonstrated Babylonian engineering capabilities while honoring the cultural preferences of peoples whose support was essential for imperial stability. By recreating the landscape that his Median queen remembered from childhood, Nebuchadnezzar showed that imperial authority could enhance rather than diminish the cultural identities that gave meaning to human life. The economic prosperity that rebuilt Babylon generated transformed the entire region into a cosmopolitan center of international trade and cultural exchange. Merchants from throughout the known world established permanent trading posts in the city, creating communities that preserved their ancestral traditions while contributing to the cultural synthesis that characterized Neo-Babylonian civilization. Craft specialization reached new levels of sophistication as artisans gained access to materials and techniques from across the empire and beyond. Babylonian workshops produced textiles, metalwork, jewelry, and ceramics that combined traditional Mesopotamian methods with innovations borrowed from Egyptian, Persian, and Anatolian traditions. The astronomical observations that had always characterized Mesopotamian science were systematized and expanded during this period, creating mathematical models of celestial motion that enabled more accurate predictions of eclipses, planetary positions, and other phenomena that influenced both religious observances and practical activities like agriculture and navigation. Legal traditions, dating back to Hammurabi, were updated and expanded to address the complex commercial and cultural relationships that characterized imperial society. International law began to emerge as diplomatic agreements between different peoples were codified according to principles that acknowledged cultural diversity while establishing common standards for resolving disputes that crossed ethnic and linguistic boundaries. But perhaps most remarkably, the Neo-Babylonian Empire created educational institutions that preserved and transmitted the intellectual achievements of all the civilizations it encountered. Schools established throughout the empire taught not just practical skills like literacy and mathematics, but the literature, history, and philosophical traditions that each culture contributed to the common human heritage. These educational programs created the ancient world's first truly cosmopolitan intellectual class, scholars who could read texts in multiple languages, understand legal traditions from different cultures, and appreciate artistic achievements that reflected diverse aesthetic sensibilities. This intellectual synthesis would influence thinking throughout the region long after the political empire that created it had disappeared. The religious tolerance that characterized Neo-Babylonian imperial policy reflected both practical political considerations and genuine theological sophistication. Nebuchadnezzar and his successors recognized that effective governance of diverse populations required respect for the spiritual traditions that gave meaning to different people's lives. Local temples throughout the empire received imperial support for construction projects and religious festivals. Priests from various traditions were invited to participate in imperial ceremonies, creating syncretic rituals that honored multiple deities while acknowledging Babylonian political authority. Religious art from different cultures was incorporated into imperial buildings, creating architectural programs that celebrated spiritual diversity within political unity. As evening settled over the rebuilt city of Babylon, as oil lamps flickered to life throughout the palace complex and temple precincts, something unprecedented had been accomplished in human civilization. Military conquest had been transformed into cultural achievement. Imperial dominance had become artistic magnificence, and political authority had been exercised through beauty rather than fear. In the hanging gardens where exotic plants from throughout the empire bloomed under Mesopotamian stars, in the great library where texts from every known civilization were preserved for future generations, in the workshops where craftsmen from dozens of different traditions collaborated on projects that surpassed anything their separate cultures could have achieved, the final flowering of Mesopotamian civilization had reached its glorious zenith. Under the eternal stars that had witnessed the rise of the first cities, the development of writing, the creation of law, and the evolution of imperial governance, the people of Neo-Babylonian Empire rested peacefully in the most magnificent city the ancient world had ever seen, confident that their achievements would inspire wonder and admiration until the end of time. The city, not merely rebuilt but reimagined, stood complete, its blue-glazed walls and golden ziggurat proclaiming to all the world that human imagination, properly directed and systematically implemented, could create beauty that rivaled the works of the gods themselves. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight, in the shadow of the Tower of Babel, humanity had achieved one of its greatest triumphs. Our journey through the corridors of time continues, as the magnificence of Neo-Babylonian achievement attracts the attention of new powers rising in the east. Discover how Cyrus of Persia will transform conquest into liberation, creating an empire built not on fear, but on respect for the dignity and traditions of all peoples. The age of tolerance awaits.